You're supposed to comment my speech.
I have never done a speech where I have not understood anything that the person speaking before me has just said, but I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting me to Lisbon. It's one of the great cities of Europe, which I only discovered in the last decade. Britain and Portugal have been friends for a very, very long time. I think our first treaty was signed in 1376, which is a lot before we became friends with the French. I'm just going to talk about what's going on in research, things that are changing, and things that are not changing. And you can see if you agree or disagree. Before I make some predictions about the future, the first thing is that the slides are only to remind me what to say next. If you want them, I'm sure Marina will send them to you, or they'll be on our website here, or you can email me here. So it's just to remind me what to say next. And the problem with predictions, for those of you who have read Philip Tetlock's books, is that they're nearly always wrong. So you need to remember that. This is a man who won an Oscar in 1924. When 100 years has passed, all thought of so-called speaking pictures will have been abandoned. It will never be possible to synchronize the sound and the picture. They did it 2 years later. This guy is somebody I like talking to on Twitter. He made a lot of money in the 1980s, Tom Peters. And Tom wrote this book, which many business people bought at airports, In Search of Excellence, those companies that we must all imitate, we must all copy. Within 3 years of Tom publishing this book, a third of the companies that he featured were either bankrupt or in severe financial difficulties. And I think this just tells us that shit happens, right? So it's difficult. So I'll make some predictions and then you can decide if they're right or not. So in terms of what we do, which is essentially understanding people and understanding what they do, why they do it, the first thing that is happening is that instead of asking questions, we can now just observe people. We have so many sources of information, so passive data will be really, really key. We've talked about big data for a very, very long time, but maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to actually start to use it. There is a joke at Google which says that big data is like teenage sex. So there is a lot of anticipation, and then when it is first attempted, there is often disappointment. And if any of you have tried big data, you will know that this is true. But eventually we will make it work. Mobiles, of course, the device that the average 24-year-old spends at least 24 hours a week looking at, is where we have to be. It's where everybody's attention is, so that will be important. And then we have this sort of, I suppose, bricolage, this, rather than just asking questions of people, we are doing things with them. We are co-creating. And, it's a much, much more fluid situation. And then finally, much, much faster. Things that when I started work 32 years ago, took me all afternoon to do a line of best fit on a chart. I can now do that in 1 second. So things will be faster. So those are my predictions. And what we're really seeing in this industry, I think, is what we are seeing in the media industry, for the media people here, which is fragmentation. So in the media, all these things, can we go forward? Oh, okay, it's stuck on here. I'm looking at one thing, and let's go back. Oh, hang on, very exciting. Sorry. All the things that we had in the 1980s are still there. All the things that I did in the 1980s, postal questionnaires, I send out 20 million postal questionnaires a year for the British National Health Service. Every doctor in Britain has a survey, and you say how happy you are on a piece of paper, and then he gets a bonus payment of £7,000 because of a postal survey. So we still do all those things. But as with the media, where we had in the 1980s posters, radio, TV, direct marketing, of course we now have all these other ways of understanding what people are doing. We are, and one of the challenges as human beings is that we only have 24 hours in the day, and if we felt busy in the 1980s, we now have all this stuff to look at, which is again, of course, one of the phenomenon that we see. If you look at mobile phones, these are Android devices grouped by size, and we have to be able to put surveys onto all those Android devices and all the iPhones and all the Huawei phones, etc. So we are We are seeing a sort of fragmentation. There are so many sources of information, but we can now, of course, look at what you're searching for, and Google search, if you haven't tried it, huge source of information. What are we looking for? We can see what we're interested in. We can see perhaps what we're planning. You will have heard the story about the father in America who writes to the shop saying, you've started sending me things about pregnancy and getting ready for babies, and I can guarantee that nobody in this house is having a baby. And then a few weeks later he writes back and says, sorry, I was misinformed. So, you know, there are some real challenges. We can see what we're clicking on, what we like, what we don't like. We can see what we're browsing as well as what we're buying. And Amazon, I think, are going to be really, hugely interesting. Massive, they're catching up with Google in advertising now. Will they control everything? We shall see. And of course we can see what we see online, and our governments can see what we see online. I sometimes wonder about the world that we now live in, where actually, if I'm honest, the freedom of speech of companies like Ipsos, we can ask questions in Portugal, and in London, and in Munich, Rome, Moscow, anywhere on earth. But of course we also have to be aware that everybody can see what we're doing. And so I sometimes wonder, should I ask about human rights in China, in Europe, because of the effects on my colleagues in China? Imagine if the Stasi and the KGB had had the tools that many of us now have. What would the outcome have been? Anyway, we can do it. And so we can also see who we talk to, who we interact with, and I want to show you how we can use some of this information in terms of what's influencing people, and to perhaps see what early signals we can pick out. And of course we now have geolocation. We can see where people are all the time with their permission. We can track people again with their permission, and we can understand exactly where they are. And of course we can see, using near-field communication, we can understand how we interact with objects, when we touch things, when we pick things up. There's a survey that we do in Britain now that is triggered every time you put washing powder in the machine. You do that, and we ask you some questions about it, because we've got a sensor on the washing powder in your house, with your permission, where we can see that you're now using the washing machine. Obviously we've got more and more film. We can see where people are, we can see how they use shops, and really interesting in the sense that often unstructured, one of the things we're seeing is an explosion of unstructured data. So rather than closed questions and large samples, which of course we now have more and more film footage. In London, the amount of storage for data that we've used it doubled in 1 year when we started using video. But to really understand people, rather than asking questions, sometimes watching them is more important. And of course we can also listen to what they're hearing in our media work. Now, of course, rather than asking people to remember what radio station they were listening to, we know what radio station they were listening to, because we're picking up the encoded signal inside the radio broadcast. We know exactly which station for how long, far more accurate than people remembering things. And of course we can even, if I go forward, do I go forward? No. Oh, it's sort of slow, sorry. We can see what we're saying, and we are now working in terms of trying to look at things like smart speakers, so using Amazon speakers, Google speakers, and listening to them. So the bottom line is that we can see all of these things. You can see all of this happening. There is less asking. Our industry is moving from asking questions, which are still important, to observation. It's moving from being quite slow to something that can often be in real time. For some of our clients in the American media industry now, we have to write a report twice a day, because they will use that information every 12 hours. We're moving from sort of one-off surveys to much more iterative approaches, where we're going around loops, where we've got the consumer outside. Sometimes now, as you will see in a minute, the consumer's inside. Rather than sort of data being somewhat inaccessible, it's much more accessible. So it's a massive shift. And sometimes, you look at this and we think, well, actually, it's not moving that fast. But then I remember that many of the things that we're doing in Ipsos today did not exist 10 years ago. And then I remind myself that things aren't moving pretty fast. To use an example, one thing that we're looking at is how we develop new ideas for products and services. And you can see somebody like Bill Bowerman, who was the guy who was a coach in the 1960s, and he noticed that his athletes couldn't get enough grip with their shoes. He's the man behind Nike. So what he does is he goes into his house and he melts a load of rubber in a waffle iron in the kitchen. God knows what everybody living in the house thought about this, but anyway, he does that. And he creates the Nike waffle sole, which gives you far more grip. And he's identified a problem and he's fixed it. But of course, how long did it take that to sort of scale? And what we can see is that somebody like Bill Bowerman was a lead user. People are trying out new things, new ways of doing things all the time. And if we could spot that, we'd have a great advantage before they get onto them, other people develop it on the market. So, the challenge at the moment with a lot of this sort of detailed research about how are people actually using something is that often it can be quite expensive. You've got to find these people who are absolutely at the cutting edge, can take time, no guarantees that it will be right. And so we looked at this and we thought about ways in which we could actually look at huge amounts of data, hundreds of thousands of people talking about how they use technology. And we partnered with MIT to look at a solution to this. And we chose kite surfing, partly because it wasn't too large an activity, but also because we could identify a large number of people who are actively involved in it on social media. And we had a process where we took 250,000 mentions and then from those started to farm them using machine learning, so without human intervention, to look for patterns. We found about 453 different ideas and clusters that we could look at, and from those we then narrowed down in terms of how they were being shared the ones that seemed to have the most potential, where people were most interested. And we came up with an electric hydrofoil, foil pumping, aqua skipper, drone surfing. From those 250,000 ideas, we narrowed it down to, and some of these are sort of pretty radical, so you need a seat for disabled people, or you can get rid of the kite completely and just start using a drone. There's a whole group of people now talking about that. But this sort of approach, where you're using all of those people's time on Instagram, the sharing that people love doing all the time, to try and identify a much more sort of systematic way of sorting through things, rather than just finding something and thinking that looks interesting, you can very quickly see where it's being shared, is it paired up with a problem, and can we actually use these approaches in other things? So we think that this is important, and actually analysing social media is going to be a huge growth area in our industry. But we're only in the beginning, only in the foothills of really understanding what it might mean. Other things happening, of course, voice assistants. Doing surveys online can be boring. So how would you feel if your who's got an Amazon speaker? Let me see what the penetration is in among trendy people in Lisbon. Who's got an Amazon speaker or a Google speaker? Only one? Rather blimey. Okay, this is you've got a huge market development here. I've got 4 of these things in my house. I can order my pet food when I'm in the bath. It's very exciting. But we've been trying out things like, the Amazon speaker says to you, would you like a voucher for 20 euros if I could just ask you some questions? Is that going to be easier than trying to send you a link, getting you to click on a whole load of questions? And we think that there's huge potential in that. Near-field communication sensors. So if you're looking at one of the problems we find in pharmaceutical work is that it's difficult to get people to remember to take their medicine, or to, of course, to remember exactly the experience of taking their medicine. So one study we've been doing in Spain is getting people with MS sufferers to remember to tap their phone every time they take their medicine. It's got prompts all over the house. As soon as they tap it, the survey opens on their phone. They tell us how they're feeling. Geolocation is hugely, I think, again, is already hugely important. We are tracking over 2,000 people in Britain at the moment, and we use that with an algorithm to create a price for all of the 460,000 poster sites in the UK. So you can then, you know, if you buy a poster in London, you buy one in Manchester, or even if you go onto the Underground and you see an advert on the tube, that the price of that would have been determined by using geolocation data, and also we know they went there, we know how long they were there, and we can then produce an algorithm that advertisers can trust in terms of telling them for all the posters how much they're actually worth. And then of course now we have mixed reality. We have virtual reality, augmented reality, and I thought we should quickly watch this while I have a glass of water. So somewhat more prosaically, virtual reality has its place in research in terms of creating real environments that we can test out ideas with people. Hugely important in testing cars now. BMW has just decided not to actually physically test cars with consumers. They will test them in virtual reality in future. Rather than building a shop and seeing how people react to it, you can create one in virtual reality. We have been working with the Royal Shakespeare Company to understand how people can react to the plays of Shakespeare in virtual reality compared to the Globe Theatre in London, some of you may have visited, or in a cinema, and to see exactly what the difference is in terms of the experience. So this particular experiment was trying to compare live at the theatre, on a cinema screen, or in virtual reality. And what was interesting about it is that if Hollywood finally does virtual reality, and it may happen, you will have a very different experience in terms of watching films. What we found as we tracked people's heartbeats during a virtual reality performance is just some massive shocks, which you don't get watching it at a cinema. So we think that overall, when we showed Titus Andronicus, which is a very violent play, in virtual reality, the overall heartbeat changed, which didn't happen at the cinema. It was like doing 5 minutes on a treadmill. People are much more engaged. So whether Hollywood is going to be able to shoot films like that, I don't know, but it will have a huge impact. This virtual reality creates this sense of presence that it is very difficult to simulate except in reality, and it's certainly more impactful than just showing you things on a flat screen. And then we have sort of just creating environments. So this is an artificial shop, and we can see how people react to different products on the shelves. In Britain, for the government, we are experimenting with, rather than trying out different road signs by the road, we are experimenting with virtual reality. So we create the new road signs, we change the colours, and we ask people to drive down take a journey across town, and we change the road signs in real time. So we can do all of these things now with virtual reality, and I think it does save a huge amount of money. So where we're left with, really, in a sense, and I think it's a very exciting future, is that we just have more things to look at than ever. We have more data than ever. The skills of researchers in understanding this stuff do not change. Old ways of doing things matter hugely. We have increased sales of pet food for Mars in Brazil by 67%. They won a prize with us for doing this. And we did that not by doing any interviewing, not even by using any of the techniques that I've just shown you, but simply by hanging out with consumers, filming them and understanding how they cook for their pets in a way that people in London don't, which completely changed Mars' ideas about what they should be trying to sell. So we have all of that stuff. I think what we're seeing then in our industry is a mass of new techniques. Some will turn out to be absolutely game changers, others will turn out to just be exciting. We are also seeing, of course, the persistence of large-scale surveys. Predicting elections. Elections are pretty exciting in Britain at the moment, and I have no idea what's happened in the last 10 minutes on Brexit. We may be in, we may be out, I don't know. But in May, using a traditional telephone survey, we were the most accurate opinion pollsters on predicting the European election results in Britain to 0.7% accuracy with a boring old telephone survey. So these things still matter, but we have so many new sources of things to understand things. And I think the bottom line is what Darwin said. He says, you know, it isn't the strongest of the species that survives, it's actually the most adaptable. And it's not even necessarily the cleverest, it is the one that is able to adapt. So our industry is all about trying new things and adaptation. We face lots of challenges. Some days in the office it feels a bit like this, you know, you've got the economy here, you've got sort of difficult clients here. But overall, it's a huge tribute for any business to last 30 years. And it will go on doing that because we will keep trying new things. And that's really, really important. Thank you so much for your patience.